Hey guys, before we start, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment if you have any feedback. Let's go to the story. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to pull a mic drop moment on my parents, but here we are. It wasn't planned. It wasn't some dramatic revenge scheme. It was just the result of years of judgment, condescension, and belittling comments finally reaching a breaking point. I'm Jake, 27, and my parents have always been obsessed with appearances. Not just how they looked, but how they were perceived by others. Everything had to be top tier, whether it was our house, our clothes, or the way they spoke about our family in public. Growing up, I learned early on that status mattered to them more than actual happiness. They weren't necessarily bad people, but they were the type to judge someone based on what they drove, wore, or earned. And unfortunately for them, I didn't turn out to be the flashy, show-off son they had hoped for. I was always more practical. I didn't care about expensive brands or luxury cars. What mattered to me was financial stability, smart investments, and living below my means. But to my parents, that made me look cheap. The first time I noticed their disapproval was when I bought my first car. It was nothing fancy, a reliable used sedan that got the job done. I had paid for it outright with my savings, and I was proud of that. But instead of being happy for me, my mom wrinkled her nose the first time she saw it. "Oh, honey, is this really what you're driving?" My dad chuckled. "I mean, come on, Jake. You could have at least gotten something a little more respectable." That word, respectable. Like driving a modest, fully paid-off car was some sort of embarrassment. It stung, but I brushed it off. I told myself they just had a different mindset, that they'd eventually understand I wasn't interested in living for appearances. I was wrong. Over the next few years, the comments never stopped. Every time I visited them, it was something new. "You still driving that thing? Don't you think it's time for an upgrade? You're making good money now, Jake. Why are you still driving around like a college kid?" I'd smile, shrug it off. But inside, it pissed me off. I was doing well financially, better than most people my age, but because I wasn't showing off with a brand new luxury car, they acted like I was some kind of failure. Then came the dinner that changed everything. I had just parked outside their house when I heard laughter from the driveway. I glanced up and saw my dad shaking his head, arms crossed, grinning. My mom was covering her mouth as if trying to stifle a giggle. And then I saw it, Jason, my younger cousin, standing beside his brand new luxury car. And that's when I realized. They weren't laughing at a joke. They were laughing at me. The second I stepped out of my car, the laughter didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. Jason smirked, leaning against his shiny new luxury car, acting like he had just won at life. I already knew what was coming before my dad even opened his mouth. "Jake," he said, shaking his head with a mocking grin, "don't you feel embarrassed pulling up next to this?" He gestured toward Jason's car like it was a trophy. My mom chuckled, looping her arm through my dad's. "It's just, look at the difference. Jason's car is sleek, elegant, and then there's yours." Jason smirked. "Hey, man, if you ever need a ride somewhere, just let me know." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. I had dealt with their passive-aggressive jabs for years, but this, laughing at me to my face? Something about it hit differently this time. Maybe it was the fact that they had never once asked me how I was doing financially. They just assumed that because I drove a used car, I was struggling. Maybe it was how they acted like Jason was some kind of financial genius just because he had a flashy car, even though I knew for a fact that he was drowning in debt. Or maybe it was just pent-up frustration from years of being treated like I was less than because I refused to play their ridiculous status games. But this time, I wasn't just going to laugh it off. I smiled, walking up to Jason's car. "Nice ride," I said casually, running a hand along the hood. "What's the monthly payment on this?" Jason's smirk faltered for just a second. Around $1,200. Plus insurance, but, it's worth it." I nodded, pretending to admire the car. "And how much did you put down?" Jason scratched the back of his head. "Not much. Just the minimum to get approved." "Why?" I shrugged. "Just curious." "So, that's about, what, 15 grand a year? Just for the car payment?" Jason shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, yeah, but and insurance must be what, another couple hundred a month?" Jason narrowed his eyes. "What's your point?" I finally turned to face my parents, who were still grinning, oblivious to where this conversation was headed. "My point," I said, pulling out my phone, "is that just because someone drives an expensive car doesn't mean they can afford it." And with that, I opened my bank app. My dad chuckled. "Oh, what? You gonna show us your gas money?" I smiled. Then, without another word, I turned the screen toward them. Their faces dropped instantly. Jason leaned forward, his cocky smirk disappearing completely. My mom's hand went to her mouth. Because right there, clear as day, was my bank balance, with over 7 figures sitting comfortably in my savings. Silence. Complete, stunned silence. And for the first time in my life, I enjoyed it. I'll never forget the look on their faces. It was like someone had just yanked the floor out from under them. Jason's cocky smirk? Gone. My dad's amusement? Evaporated. My mom's hand was still covering her mouth like she had just witnessed a crime scene. I let them stare at the number on my screen for a moment longer before I casually slipped my phone back into my pocket. Something wrong? I asked, barely holding back my grin. Jason blinked, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to piece together a sentence. That's not real. I shrugged. Check it yourself. He hesitated, but his curiosity got the better of him. He snatched my phone from my hand and stared at the screen like he was expecting to find a trick, a glitch, some kind of explanation. My dad leaned in, his eyes narrowing. Where the hell did you get that kind of money? I crossed my arms. Why not buying things I couldn't afford just to impress people who don't matter? Jason scoffed, shoving my phone back at me. Okay, but, what's the point of having money if you're not going to spend it? I raised an eyebrow. Oh, I do spend it. Just not on things that lose value the second you drive them off the lot. My dad cleared his throat, trying to regain some sense of control in the conversation. Well, that's impressive, I suppose. But a car isn't just a purchase, Jake. It's a statement. People respect success when they see it. I let out a short laugh. Oh, you mean like how you respected Jason's success 5 minutes ago? Even though he's got a 5-year loan on a depreciating asset and barely any savings? Jason's face turned red. I have savings. I tilted my head. How much? Silence. I smirked. Yeah, that's what I thought. My mom finally spoke, her voice a little too sweet, like she was trying to salvage her dignity. Well, honey, we just didn't realize you were doing so well. Why didn't you tell us? I shrugged. Because every time I tried to talk about my financial plans, you both rolled your eyes and told me I was being cheap. Another silence. My dad shifted, clearly trying to find a way to reframe the conversation in his favor. Well, Jake, don't you think it's time you upgraded? I mean, with that kind of money, you could drive anything you want. I sighed, shaking my head. Dad, I don't drive a reliable car because I have to. I drive it because I choose to. Because I'd rather put my money into investments that grow instead of liabilities that drain my account. Jason scoffed. Yeah, but don't you ever want to enjoy your money? I smiled. I do. And because I didn't waste it on a car loan, I can take months off work if I want. I can travel anywhere, retire early, or buy a house in cash. Meanwhile, in a few years, you're stuck making $1,200 payments for a car worth half its price. Jason's jaw clenched. My dad, for the first time, had nothing to say. And my mom? She just stood there, realizing that everything they had laughed at me for had made me more successful than they ever expected. For years, they had treated me like I was less than just because I didn't care about appearances. But now? Now, they knew the truth. And they couldn't laugh anymore. The silence that followed was glorious. For years, I had been the punchline to their jokes, the cheap one, the boring one, the one who just didn't understand how to enjoy life. Now they were staring at me like they had never really seen me before. Jason was still gripping his car keys like they were some kind of golden ticket, but his confidence had cracked. My dad? He looked like he was recalculating everything he had ever assumed about me. And my mom? She was searching for a way to spin this, a way to make herself look less wrong. Honey, she said, her voice softer now, you should have told us sooner. We would have been so proud of you. I let out a short laugh. Really? Because every time I tried to talk about smart money choices, you guys rolled your eyes and called me cheap. My dad cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the conversation. Listen, Jake, you've done well for yourself, and we're impressed. But don't you think it's time to start living a little? I raised an eyebrow. Define living. My mom clasped her hands together, suddenly excited again, like she had found a new angle. Well, sweetie, with that kind of money, you could upgrade your car, move into a better neighborhood, get a bigger house. Jason smirked, grasping at the last bit of his ego. Yeah, man. What's the point of stacking cash if you're just gonna sit on it? I sighed, shaking my head. You guys still don't get it. They never got it. It's not about sitting on money, I continued. It's about having options. While you're locked into 5-year car loans and mortgage payments you can barely afford, I could quit my job tomorrow and be fine. I could buy a house in cash and never worry about a mortgage. I could travel the world, start a business, retire early, because I'm not drowning in debt just to look rich. Jason scoffed, but I could tell he was rattled. Yeah, but man, what's the point if you don't enjoy life? I smirked. Oh, I enjoy my life. I just don't need a luxury car payment to do it. My dad sighed, rubbing his temples. Jake, no one's saying you should be reckless with your money. But there's nothing wrong with treating yourself. You could get a beautiful car, something that reflects your success. And there it was. That deep-rooted belief that success only mattered if people could see it. I crossed my arms. You think I'm successful now because you saw my bank balance. But the truth is, I was successful before that. You just didn't respect it because it didn't come with a shiny car. My mom opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, they had no argument left. Because deep down, they knew I was right. And for once, they couldn't laugh at me anymore. For the first time in my life, my parents looked uncomfortable in a conversation about money. Not because they were struggling, far from it. They had always been middle-upper class, but their entire mindset was built around status and perception. To them, success was measured in visible wealth, cars, designer clothes, flashy houses. The idea that I had real financial security without displaying it? That was foreign to them. Jason was still trying to save face, shifting his weight like he wanted to argue but didn't know how. Okay, he said, forcing a chuckle. So, you've got money. Cool. But what's the point if you're still driving that? He waved vaguely at my car, his nose wrinkling like it physically offended him. I tilted my head. What's the point of having a luxury car if you have to finance it? His smirk faltered. I shrugged. Let's do some math. You're paying over $1,200 a month just to drive that thing. Add insurance, maintenance, and interest, and you're dropping, what, 15 grand a year? Maybe more. Jason folded his arms, but I could tell I had hit a nerve. I continued. Meanwhile, I've got a fully paid-off car that gets me everywhere I need to go. I'm not locked into a ridiculous loan, and my money is growing instead of disappearing into a bank's pocket every month. Jason scoffed. Yeah, but at least I'm driving something people respect. I grinned. Funny. I was just about to say the same thing about my bank account. My dad sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. Jake, listen, we're not saying you're wrong, but at some point, you have to stop living like a college kid. You're almost 30. Don't you want to start enjoying your success? I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. Dad, I am enjoying my success. The difference is, I don't need a car to prove it. He opened his mouth to argue, but I wasn't finished. You guys think success means showing off. I think success means freedom. If my boss fired me tomorrow, I'd be fine. If I decided to take a year off, I could. If I wanted to buy a house in cash, I'd have options. Jason muttered something under his breath, but I ignored him. You guys spent years laughing at me, acting like I was just some cheap loser who didn't know how to enjoy life, I continued. But here's the truth, I'm ahead of all of you. Jason's face turned red. My mom looked like she had eaten something sour. My dad? He was silent, which was rare for him. Because deep down, they knew I was right. They just didn't want to admit it. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. For once, my parents weren't laughing. Jason wasn't smirking. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in for them. I wasn't the one who had been making bad decisions all these years. They were. Jason clenched his jaw, clearly struggling to come up with a comeback. Okay, dude, we get it. You're sitting on a pile of cash. But at some point, you have to live. You can't just hoard money forever. I smirked. Who said I was hoarding? Jason rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. You're not out here buying anything nice. What's the point? I sighed, shaking my head. Jason, I could take a 6-month vacation to Europe tomorrow if I wanted to. I could buy a house in cash. I could invest in anything that interests me. You think I'm not enjoying my money because I don't have a flashy car, but the reality is, I don't need to buy status symbols to prove I'm successful. My mom shifted uncomfortably. Sweetheart, no one is saying you're wrong. But don't you ever want something nice for yourself? I raised an eyebrow. Mom, I already have everything I want. A paid-off car, a fully funded retirement, no debt, and financial security. What else do I need? Jason scoffed. Dude, you're just making excuses. The truth is, you're afraid to spend money. I let out a short laugh. That's funny, coming from the guy who's afraid to check his bank balance every month. Jason's face turned red. At least I don't live like some broke college kid. I tilted my head. Yeah? And where's all your money going, Jason? You're spending over $15,000 a year on a car loan, paying rent on a place you don't own, and still living paycheck to paycheck. Meanwhile, I could quit my job tomorrow and be fine for years. My dad sighed, rubbing his temples. Jake, listen, I get what you're saying, but life isn't just about saving. Sometimes, you have to reward yourself. I nodded. And I do. The difference is, I reward myself with financial security, not debt. My mom opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. For the first time in my life, they had no response. And it was beautiful. The weight of the conversation finally hit them. For years, my parents and Jason had mocked me, laughed at my car, and acted like I was some clueless guy who didn't know how to live. But now, they were speechless. Jason, still red-faced, let out a forced chuckle. All right, man. Whatever. Do what you want. Just don't come crying to us when you realize you wasted your 20s living like a cheapskate. I shook my head. That's the thing, Jason. I'm not going to come crying to anyone. You know what? He didn't answer. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice calm but firm. Because unlike you, I don't need to stress about money. I don't wake up wondering how I'm going to make my next car payment. I don't feel trapped in a job I hate just to survive. I don't have to impress people with a car I can't actually afford. Jason said nothing. And my parents? They weren't laughing anymore. My dad sighed, rubbing his temples. Jake, I guess we just didn't realize how well you were doing. I smiled. That's because I didn't feel the need to prove it. I don't spend money to impress other people. I spend it to make sure I'm set for life. My mom exhaled, looking at me like she was seeing me for the first time. We're proud of you, honey. I nodded. I know, but you should also rethink how you define success. Jason, clearly still bitter, grabbed his keys. Whatever, man. Do what makes you happy. I smirked. I already am. And with that, I walked back to my car, my fully paid off, reliable car, knowing that for the first time in my life, my family finally understood the truth. Success isn't about looking rich. It's about actually being rich, without the debt, without the stress, and without the need to prove anything to anyone. And I had already won.